the first in-person talk since the pandemic.
We want to record it? Wow.
Welcome to the first in-person talk, co-sponsored by the Department of Political Studies and the Center for the Study of Democracy and Diversity. I'm Stephen Laren. I'm happy to be the host here for Dr. Tariq Modood. Dr. Modood was born in Karachi, Pakistan, to refugee parents, and he migrated with his family to the UK at the age of 8. He was the first to go to university from his working-class secondary school, survived years in academic exile, and broke through barriers to become known for his innovative critique of sociological theory. Today, Dr. Modood is an acclaimed expert in racism and exclusion, the founding director of the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Citizenship at Bristol University, and is widely published and regularly sought after for consultancies, fellowships, and speaking arrangements. He has been recognized as a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, awarded an MBE, made a member of the Academy of Social Sciences of the UK, and elected a Fellow of the British Academy. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Modood and his.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you very much to you and to Margaret Moore for this invitation. And in fact, it's my first time at this university. I'm very pleased to be here. And just since, I don't know, standing up and just thinking this kind of gesture, but I'm glad to be here. Just sort out my papers for a moment. Here we are. So that's my center, and this is the title of the talk, and it's actually a chapter in this book. You see that it says early 2022, a date we've actually gone past, and the book still hasn't arrived. I'm told that it will come in 2022, but Cambridge University Press, like some other presses, are running very late because of all the, last couple of years with COVID and lockdown and so on. It's actually a book that Will Kinlocker also has a chapter in. And I know, I just saw Will outside a couple of minutes ago. He's had to go somewhere in emergency, but he is coming back. But it's a shame that he's not here at the start of the talk, because a lot of the talk is a direct or indirect critical engagement with Will's position on multiculturalism, and it'd be better if you saw it from the beginning rather than miss that bit. But I did send him a copy of the paper, last year or whenever it was written. So maybe actually, he's seen this presentation, so that's maybe why he's absenting himself. In Paris, there was a conference to celebrate the 25th anniversary of Will's multicultural citizenship book. It actually took place a year late, last November, because of COVID, and actually I gave this paper then. So Will has already heard it. Good. So, start off by saying what I think multiculturalism is. And this is, if you like, a minimal definition, which obviously you can do more stuff. So it's the idea that equality in the context of difference cannot be achieved by individual rights or equality as sameness, but has to be extended to include the positive inclusion of marginalized groups marked by race and their own sense of ethno-cultural identities. It is not opposed to integration, but emphasizes the importance of respecting diverse identities. It should be understood as a mode of integration, just as assimilation is another mode of integration. So that's multiculturalism. And what do I mean by liberalism, at least for the sake of this paper? So basically, I mean two things. one methodological, one normative. They're on the slide. I mean, if you are a way of doing ethics, moral philosophy, and political philosophy that is a priori, is deductive, and claims to be universal. So, you know, Rawls is a very good example, and Kant before him. And in many ways, it is the mainstream tradition in Western political theory, though not all follow it in the same way. And I want to say that some multiculturalists follow this approach. And I want to say Will Pimlico does, perhaps also Alan Pattern, and others, but those two are probably the most systematic exponents of this approach. Except that Will's actually a slightly more complicated case than these two bullet points capture. Because I think that Will holds this view, I mean, he's a self-professed Rawlsian, but then he deduces multiculturalism out of it. He deduces certain kinds of minority rights from his Rawlsian position, and gives content to his political multiculturalism by then using an alternative method, which is much more contextual. So some people, when they see this, they say, my God, this is not at all like Will Pimlico. He's always talking about different countries, different contexts, and so on. Yes, he is, but actually he does use this theory, both the method and the normative part of it. And the contextual and the political level, I think, you know, I often can agree with what Will argues for. I think we're quite close, can be quite close on that, one or two bits of disagreement. But my main disagreement is with this part of it. So it's a theoretical disagreement with what I want to argue for. And so maybe I can characterize Will's position as saying that he thinks that multiculturalism rests on liberalism, in terms of my definition of liberalism, but multiculturalism should be pursued in a contextual way. And as I say, it's the first position that I'm challenging. I should say that on many occasions, the normative force of liberalism will be compelling. But we must not begin with the assumption that it must always be so. This, at any rate, is the approach I have followed, very much leaning on Bhikkhu Parekh on some points, and which has recently, very flatteringly, been identified as a feature of the Bristol School of Multiculturalism. I want to offer three arguments in support of my view. So the first part is about emphasizing the contextualism, which, as I say, someone like Will fits in a certain kind of way, though you'll hear me say something about that. The second part draws on an appreciation of the significance of identity and some sociological research based on that. In fact, I think I should have a slide movement. So yeah, so the first part's on the importance of national context, the second part, an argument about identity, and the third part is to do with the normative role of dialogue in a context of cultural and value conflict, and is based on my reading of Parekh. And there's a potential fourth bit about the right to create a public culture, on which I don't have a lot to say, but I do have a small bit at the end. But I've put it in brackets because if there isn't time, that's the bit I'm going to move out. So to begin with, then, the first. Will Pimlico's theory of multiculturalism as special rights is liberal egalitarian in a Rawlsian way. We cannot really understand it without knowing that it is a response to Canadian problems. This is important because the experience of other countries is quite different. Canadian multiculturalism was a response to three different sources of political agitation: Quebecer Francophone territorial nationalism, Indigenous Canadians consisting of many tribes dispersed across the vast expanse of rural Canada, and thirdly, white urban European migrants, such as Ukrainians and their descendants. At first glance, these groups seem to have nothing in common. Will offered a theory of multiculturalism uniting the three groups. He argued that individuals in minority groups with a societal culture distinct from mainstream society, as was the case in Canada, had developed into the individuals they were through accessing and exploring their societal culture. The latter was therefore a context of choice, consisting of a language, history, and way of thinking. That was a prerequisite for the development of individuals who expressed themselves through their choices. The liberal state, the goal of which was to maximize individual freedom and autonomy, had a duty to protect these societal cultures by granting them self-government and separate representation. While this theory may have been apt in relation to territorial groups, such as the Quebecois and native Canadians, it is difficult to see why Will included immigrants, naturalized citizens, and the second generation in his theory, given that he rightly stressed that this latter category of people did not enjoy a separate societal culture in their host country, even though that was one of the premises of his argument, that it should exist. For instance, in settling in Canada, they had left behind their societal culture in their land of origin and now became part of the societal culture of Canada. This difficulty is deepened by the fact that while Will included immigrants and their descendants in his theory of multiculturalism, he did not think that they were entitled to the rights at the center of his theory. While Quebecers and Indigenous Canadians were entitled to self-government and special political representation, post-immigration groups were not. The latter's special rights were limited to rights which facilitated respectful integration and prevented exclusion from the mainstream populace, as well as the formation of separate communities. While it is fair to say that Will is the most cited political theorist on multiculturalism and also has attracted the most political interest internationally, most of this interest does not revolve around his full theory, nor indeed the politics ensuing from his full theory, but rather relates to the issue of immigration and post-immigration integration or settlement, which has become increasingly prominent over the past 50 years. Thus, the focus is on politics, with which his theory of special rights, as opposed to Will's writings in general, because obviously it's very extensively written about lots of different countries, lots of different contexts, lots of different issues, all within his work on multiculturalism. But the focus is on politics, with which his theory of special rights least connects. Of course, Will has been a prolific writer on issues of post-immigration integration and equal citizenship, and has many acute and compelling comments to make. However, all these relate to diversity within a newly shared culture, and not his theory of special rights. Let me illustrate by reference to the UK. In Britain, multiculturalism emerged quite differently to the process in Canada. In Britain, there were no indigenous people, not as you understand them in Canada. There were incipient and soon to become quite strong territorial minority nationalisms that could be compared to the case of Quebec, namely in Scotland, Wales, and albeit differently, Northern Ireland. Such politics, however, were understood in terms of home rule, devolution, nationalism, or multinationalism, never multiculturalism. Hence, what was called multiculturalism in Britain fell outside and was much smaller in scope than the main special rights of Will's theory. Moreover, in relation to immigrants, the British example had three important characteristics missing in the Canadian case. First, the immigrants were not random individuals who were requesting permission to enter a country with which they had no prior connection, such as, say, the Ukrainians. Originating from countries such as India, Pakistan, and the West Indies, they were part of the British Empire, or those parts of it that had very recently become part of the Commonwealth. They were part of the British story. This was not merely symbolic. During 1948 to 1962, their legal status, which is called subjects of the Crown, was the same as that of Britons, and they had the same right of access into the UK. Second, while the Canadian multiculturalism policy of 1971 sought to offer integration to immigrants who were white Europeans while still respecting their cultural distinction, in the UK, the immigrants were not white, but marked by race. Indeed, for decades, immigrant in Britain meant coloured or not white. Even now, ethnic minority is a synonym for not white and is rarely used to include Jews, the Irish, or recently settled European citizens. Compared to European origin immigrants in Canada, this racialization in Britain created a much stronger form of exclusion and second-class status, a legacy of the same empire that now gave them rights equal to those of indigenous British nationals. It also meant that British multiculturalism emerged after a period in which the first political priority was not cultural identity, but racial equality and anti-colour racism. The result is that anti-racism runs through British multiculturalism, which is understood ideationally and as political action in a way that is not comparable to the position in Canada, and possibly is more so than anywhere else. These two originating features, British membership and racism, these two originating features, no less than the multinational character of Britain, paved the way for the view that all subjects stroke citizens were British, but that not all were the same kind of British, or indeed British in the same way. It took some decades to mature, but the seeds of the idea of a plural Britishness have this historical depth. Perhaps ultimately one of imperial legacy, and not just on the part of the white British, but also from those, for example, the West Indians, who had brought with them concepts such as Britain as the mother country. In Britain, the politics of post-immigration began not with issues about naturalization and assimilation, as seems to have been the case in much of continental Europe, but with racial equality and challenging racialized, narrow islander definitions of Britishness. The third feature that distinguishes British from Canadian multiculturalism and Will's theorizing of it is religion. As the diversity and distinctive character of different minority groups began to be recognized in Britain, racial equality was extended to cover ethnicity and religion. These two were not easily separated. illustrated, for example, by the House of Lords decision, whereby banning the wearing of the religious turban by Sikh men was actually a form of ethnic discrimination, and therefore racial discrimination in law. That's the Mandela versus Lee case that some of you know. As ethnic group pride and assertiveness became an accepted feature of, and indeed the vehicle for promoting equal citizenship, South Asian identities began to increasingly take on an ethno-religious character. Non-whiteness remained a social divide, but racism began to be thought of in terms of racisms and in compound forms such as cultural racism, anti-Muslim racism, and so on. From the time of the Satanic Verses affair in the late 1980s, Muslim political activism began to loom large in the emergent multiculturalism. Furthermore, after 9/11 in the US and 7/7 suicide bombings in London, it became central to a multiculturalism that was being overwhelmed by security concerns and, according to some observers, died. This centrality of religion was reflected in British theorizing. While Will made it clear that his theory of special rights and state support was not extendable to religious groups, which had to be content with religious freedom, toleration, and a neutral state, rather than expect recognition and accommodation. As perhaps some or all of you know, Will has changed his mind on that last bit. But what's really interesting is he's changed his mind without revising his theory. So as far as I see, just an ad hoc revision. It's not totally ad hoc because it is a genuine response to circumstances. So that shows a politically contextual sensitivity, which I'm all for. But what's it got to do with this theory? Finally, I should add that the story of Canadian multiculturalism, by multiculturalism now, I mean what is popularly and indeed universally understood as multiculturalism, that is to say, nothing to do with Quebec-type nationalism, nor the rights of Indigenous people, that this multiculturalism in Canada looks like a top-down politician's policy program. In contrast, the features of British membership, anti-racism, black pride, and religious identity assertiveness are very much a reflection of the political priorities of the ethnic minority communities and the campaigns they have mounted. This bottom-up feature in Britain has meant that a politics that begins with the integration of racialized groups expands and complexifies the idea of race beyond its original meaning, yet continues to press for the critical aspect of race within multiculturalism. This account about Britain should make it clear that while Will created a liberal theory of special rights, most of his theory and its rights address Canadian non-immigration issues. Moreover, insofar as Will's liberalism addressed the rights of post-immigration groups, the nature of these groups in Britain in terms of national history, race and religion were quite different from that in Canada. My suggestion is not that Britain is typical of other countries. I'm not saying, oh, Canada is exceptional, Britain is typical, not at all. In one sense, all countries are distinctive. My claim is that a Canadianized academic liberalism focused on a secessionist francophone nationalism and indigenous people does not capture the multiculturalist struggles centered on post-immigration ethno-religious group formations. The implication is that this lack of fit will apply to other countries, may apply anyway to other countries, for which the challenge of integration and multiculturalism originates in immigration and settlement rather than subnationalism and indigeneity, further limiting the pertinence specifically of Will's theory and more generally of the universalizability of theories that do not properly connect with a variety of contexts. So that was my first argument, and as it were, this is what I've been arguing. So I didn't use the PowerPoint because I wanted you to listen to me, but if you want to say, well, what's he been saying for the last 10 minutes? I like to think that those are the points that I made. So I turn now to the second argument, and just to remind you what that is, that's the one about identity. Liberalism's primary medium is that of values, principles, and laws. One of the ways to de-absolutise liberalism in relation to multiculturalism and the respectful inclusion of minorities is to recognise the sociological and normative significance of other features of social life. The one I principally have in mind here is a sense of identity. In the 1990s, I was the principal researcher of the 4th National Survey of Ethnic Minorities, a large nationally representative survey in England and Wales, comprising of over 5,000 respondents that was in the field in 93-94. The survey covered many different topics. It included an innovative section on ethnic identity and cultural practices, probing aspects of minority identities that no survey, as far as I'm aware, had ever done with such a large and nationally representative sample. I was particularly struck by 4 findings. Firstly, different minorities prioritized different kinds of identities. While skin color, black, was prominent in the self-descriptions of Caribbeans, it barely featured in the self-descriptions of South Asians, for whom country of origin, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, was more important, including for those born in Britain. One significance of this was that the public discourse in which black was presumed to be the public identity of all who were not white and endorsed by the Commission for Racial Equality had not displaced the self-chosen ethnic identity of the South Asians. Secondly, for South Asians, the religion of one's family was just as important a source of self-identity, and for Muslims, more important than national origins. This owed as much to a sense of community as to personal faith, but the identification and prioritization of religion was far from just a nominal one. This was to grow over time, especially for Muslims. A survey done in spring 2006 found that while 79% of Muslim 16 to 34-year-olds said that religion was very important to the way they lived their life, slightly more than their elders, and on a number of questions the young were tending to be more Islamic or more radical than their elders. Perhaps radical should be in quote marks there. Where this generational contrast, that's another survey showed this generational contrast to be even stronger. Moreover, such religious identities could not be characterized as belonging to private life and irrelevant to public policies and resources. For example, half the Muslims interviewed in the 4th survey said that there should be state funding for Muslim schools. The third striking feature was that these religious and ethnic identities were not simply an expression of behavior, of participation in distinctive cultural practices. For across the generations and in relation to time spent in Britain, there was a noticeable decline in participation in the cultural practices, to do with language, dress, attendance at a place of worship, and so on. that go with a particular identity. Yet the decrease in self-identification with a group labeled Black or Muslim was relatively small. That is to say, it was not anomalous, for example, for people self-identifying as Sikh or Muslim to not be at all religious. So if there's a sense in which race and ethnicity had been religionized, it was also the case that for some, religion had been ethnicized. These new ethno-religious, what I call associational identities, are not to be thought of as passive or fading identities. That would be to overlook the pride with which they may be asserted, the intensity with which they may be debated, and their capacity to generate community activism and political campaigns. The fourth important feature is that these minority identities, various as they are, do not necessarily compete with a sense of Britishness. Half of the Chinese, but more than 2/3 of those in the other minority groups also said they felt British. I say also meaning they said they felt, they're Pakistani or Muslim or Black. They also said they felt British. And these proportions were, as one might expect, higher amongst young people and those who'd been born in Britain. The majority of respondents had no difficulty with the idea of hyphenated nationality or multiple identities, which has become a commonplace idea since then. Interestingly, later studies have consistently found that national identification and patriotism amongst ethnic minorities, including Muslims in Britain, are higher than the population as a whole. A little bit counterintuitive, but it's been confirmed by other surveys, not just a single finding. An analysis of 2 citizenship surveys concluded, I quote, "We find no evidence that Muslims or people of Pakistani heritage were in general less attached to Britain than were other religions or ethnic groups, including Christian, or including white." A later survey report concluded that, I quote, "British Muslims are more likely to be both patriotic and optimistic about Britain than are the white British community." What I conclude, let me show you what I think I've just argued. So those are the 4 points that I said struck me from the work that we did in the 4th survey on cultural identity. What I conclude from such research is that minority communities and their relations with the mainstream society is not just about differential values or just about values. People have identities which are adaptable and can change, sometimes even over short periods of time, which can be very important to them, and not just on the basis of conformity to community norms and cultural practices. The sources of identity can be a sense of self, a collective intersubjectivity, partly produced by origins and the past, but also by one's current location in society. How one is perceived and treated by others, and hopes and struggles to change that. Moreover, such minority identities are not monistic or essentialist, but can vary across the group, not least generationally, and are open not just to change, but to fusing or combining with other identities. An important combining was with a national identity such as British, or growing and grafting one's minority identity into the national identity. Most ethnic minority persons thought of themselves as British, wished to be British, and wanted to be accepted as such. It seemed to me then, as it does now, that this identity data was fundamental to thinking about multiculturalism. That together with the equal citizenship and racism that I've already referred to, it was a better place to start thinking about and building a multiculturalist society and polity than to begin with values or the clash of values or the requirements of liberalism. Societies and polities hold together and function because there's a desire to belong. That this was not monistic but multi-layered and cross-cutting, including minority identities and the national identity or identities, given that we are multinational and have multiple perspectives on Britain, that the national identities ought to be nurtured as a ground for multiculturalism. Societies hang together or fall apart because of the power of identities and the desire to belong, not just because of values, principles, and laws, the stuff of liberalism. The emergence, nurturing, development, and sustaining of multiculturalism, including necessary forms of commonality, must be done at the level of identities and not just rights and values. Of course, multiculturalism is not value-free. For a start, the aspiration and movement for multiculturalism depends on concepts of non-discrimination and concept of equal concern and respect. However, having established the principle of recognition of equal respect as part of equal citizenship, we should not then decide all questions, all ethical political dilemmas by asking, what would a liberal do here? In many ways, this is to go backward into a pre-multiculturalist abstract universalism. We should ask, what would a multiculturalist who was part of this society, not just an abstract individual or an unembedded universalist, what would a multiculturalist who was part of this society do here? For example, when we ask if one or more religions should be taught or allowed to organize worship in public schools, or if turbans can be worn by judges in court, or whether Holocaust deniers should be imprisoned, and if so, up to what length of time, we know that these questions are answered differently in the US, Britain, and France. In each case, there will be some deployment of liberal arguments, but they will be interpreted in ways that fit the public culture in each country and its own sense of how to balance personal freedom, equality, public good, religious conscience, free speech, incitement to hatred, and so on. This leads me to my third argument. And this section is called Operative Public Values as a basis for multicultural dialogue. Again, if you like to go back, yeah, I just say dialogue there. So anyway, the third argument. In his Rethinking Multiculturalism, Diku Parek had argued that if we were to take value diversity seriously, then we must recognize that liberalism was one of a number of value traditions and positions, each of which had something to say about what makes a good life, how society should be organized, what goals should be pursued, and so on. If so, it meant that liberalism was one of the players, and so it could not at the same time be the umpire. It could not be the exclusive frame in which questions of value were pursued or through which other positions were evaluated. That was an unjustified privileging of liberalism, and such an aspiration must be given up in favor of an umpire-less dialogue between the various moral traditions and forms of life. Liberalism had a lot to offer, Parek argued, had a lot to offer. It was a persuasive moral philosophy but it must also be prepared to learn from other moral perspectives. Yet, of course, most practical dilemmas to do with policy, institutional rules, and law cannot be addressed by such lofty dialogue. Considering practical and policy questions, Parekh argues that every society must appeal to some values to regulate its public spaces, and he calls these operative public values. And these will vary by society, though there are bound to be some overlaps across societies. The operative public values are not all derived from a single principle. Indeed, while, I quote, interrelated, they do not form a coherent whole and sometimes pull in different directions. Nevertheless, a practical dialogue about, for example, whether female circumcision or polygamy should be allowed must start there, with the operative public values. They're embodied in the Constitution, the laws and norms governing civic relations of the society in question. They reflect a particular historical and moral legacy, and so in that sense, they're not universal and may indeed be said to be biased against newly settled minorities and perhaps others. It means that every society, again I quote, needs to periodically reassess its operative public values, and the fact that a minority practice offends against some of them provides it with a welcome opportunity to do so. In a society like Britain, the operative public values have a strongly liberal character, but it has its own take on what are liberal values, and this will not be identical to how they're interpreted elsewhere. I mean, compare how liberty and equality are quite differently interpreted in Britain and France. Moreover, while Britain is a liberal society, it's not merely liberal. It is also conservative, Christian, collectivist, and nationalist in various ways too, and this will be reflected in its operative public values. Consider the case of marriage. A pure liberalism might leave the drawing up of a contract to whatever two or more individuals choose for themselves, as John Stuart Mill argued. But that is not what we have in Britain. In fact, we don't have that anymore. It is liberal. What we have in Britain is liberal in some ways and has in recent decades been more liberalized. But few argue that this liberalization should be taken to its, as it were, nth million degree. Liberals see these matters as a clash between a universal principle, such as gender equality, and a cultural practice, such as polygamy, especially polygyny, that's to say, only men or husbands having multiple wives. Firstly, we have to recognize that the contemporary Western objection to polygamy is not merely about liberal principles, but is mixed up with a preference for certain sexual relations and family formations that clearly have a cultural form. Otherwise, the objection would be to polygamy only, whereas no liberal public is discussing the possible inclusion of polygamy. So the kind of liberalism that is operative here, that will set the terms of dialogue in relation to minority practices that are queried as prima facie not acceptable, is distinctly contextualized and qualified liberalism, neither pure nor the same as anywhere else. So again, here's a retrospective summing up slide. Yeah, so these are the points I've just been making. Even so, it may be thought, that what I've described is not real dialogue, as the terms are loaded in favor of the majority and the status quo. Well, yes, The important thing is that there should be the possibility of a dialogue, rather than merely status quo liberal enforcement. And where else could a practical dialogue begin? As it were, an illiberal minority is likely to feel it has less room for maneuver and feel more coerced if it is told its practices must be subjected to liberalism, because it will perceive the latter as the majoritarian rather than independent standard. The honest description of what faces a minority here is that to defend its practices, it will need to, I quote from Parek, it will need to appeal to values the wider society itself subscribes to or can be persuaded to share. End of quote. Or, I will add, coexist with. Parek illustrates this formula for a dialogue in relation to controversies such as female circumcision and polygamy. An example of a successful dialogue that I have witnessed over the years is in relation to the protection of Muslims against aggressive words in Britain. When the anger against Salman Rushdie's novel The Satanic Verses was first expressed by Muslims in Britain, many expressed their outrage by designating it as apostasy. When that was met with incomprehension by the media and public commentators, and particularly when that charge was getting mixed up with Ayatollah Khomeini's fatwa calling for the death of the author, most Muslims began to ask to be protected by the laws of blasphemy. When it was clear that there was little support for the existing law of blasphemy, so this is all Britain, little support for the existing law of blasphemy amongst politicians, let alone for extending it to Muslims, the same activists and organizations started framing their demands in terms of an incitement to religious hatred legislation to complement the laws in respect of race. This too was initially thought by the main body of informed opinion as inappropriate for religion and as a threat to free speech. But in due course, it became law. So that's why I'm calling it a dialogue, because Muslims shifted their position, but then so did the rest of British society, or at least the lawmakers. It was also the case that at the time of the Danish cartoons affair, several major European newspapers republished the cartoons out of solidarity. But no British paper did so on the grounds that to do so was to give gratuitous offence. This is the kind of dialogue and two-way learning that is being described here as a multiculturalist use of operative public values and exemplifies Parek's point that, I quote, since moral values cannot be debated and defended in an objective way and conclusive manner, and since it is difficult to be wholly detached and open-minded about one's moral values, the dialogue involves passages of incomprehension, intransigence, irreconcilable differences, and so on. Which is exactly what happened with the Satanic Verses. But as you heard me say, in the end, we had a law that gave the Muslim protesters something that they'd been arguing for, i.e., we had comprehension. Parek concludes, my final quote from Parek concludes, while a society has an obligation to accommodate the minority way of life, it has no obligation to do so at the cost of its own, especially if it remains genuinely unconvinced by the minority's defense of its practice. So those were my three main points. I said to you I had a fourth, but I think I'll leave that out. Maybe it'll come up in the discussion. Why take up more of your time? So I'll just conclude. This Bristol School of Multiculturalism approach that I've been putting to you does not begin with liberal principles, and it seeks to go beyond liberalism, but it exists within a liberal democratic framework of individual rights and a culture of civility and dialogue, as well as protest and radical activism. So it presupposes a robust framework of rights, which it seeks to multiculturalize through continually arguing about rights and reforms and policy measures to assist disadvantaged groups or abuse of individuals within groups. Some of these arguments may be recognizably liberal. Others will focus on how to dismantle othering, offer positive recognition, and meet the distinctive needs of minorities without assimilating their needs and preferences to those of the majority. I concede that there's a limit to the flexibility of identities. Special focus should be put, however, on multiculturalizing the national identity, which is important for bringing people together across ethno-cultural difference, and which itself is essential to multiculturalism, as I've argued elsewhere. So while a focus on identity, both in terms of recognition and in terms of fostering commonality and societal unity, is not sufficient, it is a necessary dimension that political theorists who frame things in terms of liberalism miss, and thereby miss both what needs to be addressed and what is needed for liberal, amongst other, values to be secured. Nor do socialists, human rights champions, cosmopolitans, or localists give minority identities and national belonging the same centrality as does multiculturalism, or at least as does my version of multiculturalism, mainly because they can be too much under the sway of liberalism. So, thank you. Yeah, that's it.
I think we're going to go back.
Leave a slide on.
Thank you very much. I'll open the floor to questions, and I do mean questions rather than comments.
Did you say questions rather than comments? I'm happy to receive comments, yeah. And they can be critical comments, they can be supportive comments, yeah, sure.
Floor is open.
Well, I guess I'll begin. I actually have quite a few questions, but I'll sort of start. I really, first of all, really enjoyed that. I thought that was really great. And I had lots of thoughts as you were speaking. One of the questions, maybe I'll ask two. I don't know if I can sneak in two, but one question I had is about dialogue. And the reason is, it wasn't clear to me how you would, this was a short paper, but you might think of dialogue as a kind of empirical, like in your example of the way in which public policy is made through dialogue, it looked like an empirical dialogue, right, between maybe people, elites, and arriving at some kind of a compromise and shifting positions. But you might also think that dialogue, sometimes we talk about the idea that a group makes a claim and we want to know whether the claim is justifiable. And so you have a kind of dialogue that looks like a slightly more idealized, right? Like an ideal speech situation, right? So I guess I'm wondering if you think of the dialogue as simply an contestation empirically, arriving at a position, and as long as the position is in some realm of compromise, or you might think that that's going to be insufficient because one group, usually the majority group, you have to begin there, and so the dialogue will result in a position that's actually still not fair.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, I want you to talk a little bit about dialogue, because I think in our heads we often move from one to the other, but they obviously are different. So that was like a question I had.
Yes.
What questions are going one-on-one?
Might as well start with one.
Yeah, let's start that way. There aren't exactly a lot of people here. So, yeah, happy to just try and address that question. Thank you, Margaret. That's a very fair question. So let me begin by saying that I offer an empirical case, namely the Satanic Verses affair. The Muslim protests and demand for some kind of state response, law, policy, whatever. Because to just talk about dialogue without offering any examples isn't very helpful. So I think people might rightly say to me, oh, well, what do you mean? Give us an example of a successful dialogue. So I give that as an example. But you're quite right. I'm kind of using it as an empirical case without necessarily evaluating it by an independent standard to say, well, was the resolution of the dialogue in the satisfactory place? By my standards, for instance. So this really does kind of push me to think about, well, what independent standards do I have at the back of my mind in talking about multiculturalism generally, but specifically about, as it were, good dialogues? And I don't know. I mean, one way round it is to say, well, a good dialogue should be understood not in terms of a conclusion, but in terms of a process. And that's a pretty standard approach in a deliberative democracy and, as you say, ideal speech situations and so on. So I guess I too would want to join that consensus, but how I can flesh it out, I'm not sure. Obviously, the minority or minorities have to be heard, and also, if you like, minorities within minorities, because obviously not all Muslims have the same view at all. And you don't just want to hear those who shout the loudest. You said that it was it could be described as an elite dialogue, and that part of it doesn't bother me so much. Well, it depends what we mean by elite. I mean, many of the people protesting clearly couldn't be described as elite. I mean, there were people who lived in poor neighborhoods, who had very little access to the sources of power and to, the mass media and so on. But if you mean a kind of political dialogue as opposed to what people were talking about when they were waiting for a bus at the bus stop, yes, in that sense, it's a kind of macro level dialogue. And what I described took place over about 15 years. From the point of the novel and the protest to the legislative change. And in fact, it wasn't a single legislative change. There were two, which again meant more period of time. Altogether, then, we're talking about nearly 20 years. So that's what I mean by dialogue, that kind of macro level, political and intellectual debate and flow. I don't think I'm in a position to specify what are the independent conditions for a successful dialogue. So some kind of inclusion would clearly have to be included, but I couldn't, specify it in terms of any precision, certainly not necessary and sufficient conditions. And one would expect, it would be a rare occasion for a dialogue to take place where both sides didn't shift their position. I'm not saying it couldn't happen. A typical dialogue has to involve some mutual learning and mutual accommodation. So, beyond saying those kinds of things, I don't think I can be more precise about how do we distinguish between a good dialogue and a bad dialogue. apart from, of course, the bad dialogue one, where it doesn't take place. So my favorite example of bad dialogues would be the kinds of things that happen in France. So various presidents get up and say there must be a national debate on what it means to be French. Sarkozy did that, Macron's done that, and so on. And then there is international debate because some elite French people talk to each other, and they're all talking about Muslims, but not engaging with Muslims. So if you like, I'll offer you one condition. The dialogue must be, the people who are being talked about must be parties to the dialogue and not just be the objects of dialogue. So that's a pretty important condition. And that's part of what, of course, we mean by inclusion.
Okay, other questions or comments?
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the presentation. I had a question about how the British emphasis on anti-racism differentiated Canadian multiculturalism from British multiculturalism, if that makes sense, right? So, yeah.
Well, as I said, I mean, these things happen in a particular time and place. So it wasn't just someone just said, hey, wouldn't it be a good idea if we had a multiculturalism that had a stronger anti-racism component than they have in Canada? So obviously not like that. It was because these issues were pressing issues in Britain in the way that they weren't in Canada when the policy of multiculturalism kicked off in the early 1970s. I mean, perhaps they're pressing now. And that's, I see a lot of younger Canadian scholars, in fact, being very critical of multiculturalism because they're saying it doesn't take issues around racialization and settler colonialism seriously enough and so on. So of course, and even in Britain, of course, we have these debates and new issues arise and so on. And looking at your facial expression, I just want to check, am I answering your question or did I?
Yeah. No, thank you. I'm just wondering, like, so how did that make British multiculturalism different than Canadian multiculturalism?
Yeah. Okay, so so as I see it, and as I say, allowing for the fact that it's changed over time and will continue to change, Canadian multiculturalism is pretty colourless. It doesn't refer to people by colour. It refers to them by their origins, by their language group, possibly, by their cultural customs. But in Britain, even the very term ethnic minorities means groups that are racialized. But racialized doesn't just mean color racism. That's the point I made, not in great detail. I've argued for it elsewhere, that we've come to talk about racisms, and we recognize that cultural racism and Islamophobia as a particularly prominent form of cultural racism is probably, in some respects, is the dominant, least addressed form of racism in Britain and Western Europe. And therefore, no multiculturalism can ignore it. So we build on a form of anti-racism, which is not to say that everyone who is an anti-racist says they're a multiculturalist. In fact, they may be very critical. They may say that multiculturalists don't sufficiently focus on systemic socioeconomic exclusion and structural racism. They may say that the stuff about culture and identity is of secondary or tertiary importance. The primary importance is to do with power and economic resources and things like that. So obviously, most multiculturalists don't subscribe to that kind of materialism. We think, yeah, issues about equality must be about things like income and wealth and access to political voice and influencing political change and so on. That's part of an understanding of equality. But if you said to me, why am I not merely an anti-racist? Why do I say I'm a multiculturalist who wants to bring and keep anti-racism as part of it? I'd say part of my argument would be that I think anti-racists have too narrow a view by only talking about colour, and usually two colours, black and white. All the other colours are kind of included through a kind of honorary status, at least they are in Britain. And so even where they're kind of nominally included, once you hear a speech or an article or whatever get going, they tend to drop out. There may be a footnote saying, of course, when I mean black, I mean all the other colours that are not white. But it's a bit like saying, when I mean men, I mean men, women, and so and so. So yeah, it's not a deeply pluralistic view. Secondly, it can be too materialistic, where, you know, or if you like, materialism plus power, you know, economic reductionism versus a certain kind of power relations reductionism. And my third objection to it would be, it's not sufficiently offering people a positive view. I think it's absolutely essential that something that calls itself an ism should both have a negative critique, i.e. identifies problems, but it should say something about, what should we do about those problems, which is a kind of a positive thing to do, which is not just a removal of the negative. It's embedded in a positive vision, and above all, a positive vision that brings all citizens together and doesn't just appeal to promoting the interests of one section at the likely expense of another section of the population. So it's not an easy thing to have this kind of, to combine how to improve the lot of a disadvantaged group and do something that has a vision of the common good or the general good, promotion of something that all citizens can subscribe, can own up to. And I think that's absolutely essential for something that calls itself politicalism.
So I enjoyed that, Terry. I tend to be a slow thinker, right? So it takes time for me to put the bits together. So I need a bit of help. I had the same question that Margaret asked about what are the other limits. By what standard would one say that what's going on here is inappropriate? And it seems to be that as long as the minority side has a voice, you're okay. And it strikes me that may leave a lot of situations, kind of unpleasant situations, with no standard by which to say this is inappropriate. So that's really Margaret's question, and I just want to flag that I'm not sure I'm fully comfortable with where we're at the moment. The second, my second question is I didn't fully follow the logic about Will's interpretation. So, and it may be because you started by commenting about much of what you're talking about was about Will, and you didn't set out, or I missed, the larger logic of the paper, which is about liberalism. And he's just one case. So then let me ask for greater clarity about the argument about that case. So you argue much of the core argument about special rights is really about sub-state nations, indigenous peoples. Fair enough. But it wasn't clear where that left your interpretation of Kimlicka on immigrant group policies, diversity policies. Because it strikes me as I listen to what you're looking for, that what Will would probably argue for if he were here for immigrant groups is not inconsistent with what you're talking about. The kind of norms that he advocates for, may not be strictly derived from the idea of a societal culture, but they may well fit with you what I take to be your political project. So I'm not quite sure that I follow the fit.
Okay, thank you, Keith. So beginning with the first one, yeah. So as you recognise, your question shares something with Margaret's in the sense of, well, what are the kind of the limits of some of the things you may advocate or approve of? What are the standards that we will want to appeal to? What are the values, if you like, principles we want to appeal to? So I recognise that my position has some indeterminacy, and I suppose some of that indeterminacy is, if you like, just me. I don't have the answers, but I'd like to be, if you like, a bit more clever about that than that. I'd like to say that some of the indeterminacy goes with the territory, that the kind of political theorist that thinks we first must have, or not first in terms of like chronological order, I mean logical order, that we have to have independent principles in order to have a multiculturalist politics going, that isn't the case. So we don't need to be clear in our minds about what the independent standards are. So then the question is, well, what kind of things will we be arguing about, and what will we be appealing to in those arguments? So there I lean on Bhikkhu Parekh's idea of operative public values. So it's not the case then that all I'm saying is, well, as long as the minority voice participates, I'm more or less satisfied. And not simply because, as I said to Margaret, well, there will be some other conditions and so on. But clearly, inclusion is absolutely central to the idea of dialogue. There has to be two parties or more, but at least two parties. And so the thing that I said at the end of my answer to Margaret, that the minority must be included in the dialogue and not just the object of the dialogue, I think is absolutely.
And do you think that's sufficient? That is
well, no, it can't be quite sufficient. No, because minorities can ask for unreasonable things, but how will we know they're unreasonable? Through discussion, where we appeal to a variety of things which we think are important. Or when I say we, I don't mean each one of us. I mean collectively we think are important. So they will overlap. And some things that some people think are important, I think are not very important. But as a society, we think they're important. So that's drawing on a lot more than just, oh, as long as the minorities are included, I'll be satisfied. So I want to emphasize that even in a liberal democratic society like Canada or the UK, we're not just talking about liberalism. We're talking about several, as it were, imperfect, contingently and not fully formed isms which are changing over time, synthesizing and so on. And that's a more realistic context for multiculturalist dialogues than the kind of liberalism I put up on my first slide. I ought to say, I recognize that that doesn't exhaust liberalism. Obviously, there are other kinds of liberalism. But one kind of liberalism that's diametrically opposed to the one I had on the slide is, if you like, the kind of Isaiah Berlin type. Because he emphasizes plurality, and he doesn't want there to be fixed a priori principles of liberalism from which everything else follows either. So, in fact, some people describe Isaiah Berlin as a multiculturalist. Not a term he used, but they just say his position is a multicultural position before the term got going. I think there's something in that, but I think he doesn't think sufficiently about groups in the way that multiculturalists do. He thinks very much in terms of individuals, therefore, negative liberty and positive liberty. And it's a relationship between the individual and the state. There isn't a lot left in the middle. I mean, there is in some of his writings and so on, but it's not quite clear as a kind of liberal position. And that then really connects me to the second thing, which you asked me, well, what am I really objecting to in talking about Will Pimlicker's multiculturalism? Given, as you say, that many of the things I'm arguing for are things that Will himself has argued for, or could argue for, without too much alteration, amendment. But I think that's the problem, not the solution. That's what makes his theory redundant, because I can hold all the views that you say Will can hold, but I don't hold his theory. So that means his position isn't derived from his theory. His theory is idle. That's my biggest objection. The theory is not doing any work for my kind of multiculturalism. Oh, if you say, oh, it's doing a lot of work for sub-state nationalism or indigenous people, you may or may not be right. I'm not even asking myself that question. All I'm saying is, what does Will's theory do for my kind of post-immigration, ethnic and religious formation multiculturalism? And I'm saying, Will's got some great views, but they don't rest on his theory. It's because he's a nice guy.
Is that any different than your situation?
He's close to my situation in being a kind of pragmatic multiculturalist. Yeah, exactly. So then surely he must choose. He's got two inconsistent positions. He's got one which says multiculturalism rests on liberalism, and he's got another position which is the in-practice position, the comparative multiculturalism's in motion position, which is, oh, I don't need to refer to my theory.
And you think his attitudes towards, you think his attitudes towards immigrant minorities is not consistent with liberalism? I mean, I would be surprised by that argument. Is that what you're saying?
But the question is then, what is liberalism? As you saw, I defined it very narrowly with just two propositions. A priori universalism, which Will clearly does hold. I mean, he doesn't have to bring it out every time he speaks, but he is committed to that. I clearly am not. So I don't say that autonomy is the highest ethical good. If you say to me, well, what is the highest ethical good? I may say I don't know. But I certainly want to deny that there is one ethical good, and that is autonomy. But Will wants to affirm that. So that's a fundamental disagreement. I can say everything that Will wants to say about immigrant minorities and so on, without holding to his first theoretical proposition. And what about his second theoretical proposition? Namely, that it's deductive kind of theory, i.e. a priori. Well, but as you yourself are saying, that's not how he does multiculturalism. So he doesn't follow the method, and I deny his first proposition, his normative proposition. And yet we hold the same conclusions. That usually means, in a syllogism, it usually means that there's a faulty premise. And I'm saying the faulty premise is, well, they're both faulty in a kind of way, because he himself doesn't practice the methodological premise, and he does hold the normative premise about autonomy, but I'm saying the conclusions follow without holding that first principle premise about autonomy.
Well, okay, I'm going to pause here. I'd be interested.
I wish Will was here, because obviously it'd be good to have this exchange with
Well, maybe we'll get up later.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have Katie, then Margaret, and is anybody else, and then Bruce, and I'll note that we have 10 minutes. We can probably go 15 minutes.
I apologize for taking too long.
Yeah, I think it's a very important thing.
So my question is about, in a sense, about the relationship between identity and dialogue, and the work that relationship does. Because I guess the thought that I'm having, and maybe this is a sort of Canadian context-based thought, is that the dialogue is in part going to be shaped by the relationship between the group identities and the way that those identities are recognized institutionally. So it seems like in the discussion that we've been having, that identity is a kind of like group first idea, like you talked a lot about how particular individuals will often hold multiple identities, and those identities seem to be very much like they're significant because the individuals hold them. There is also a sense in which the way that, for example, state institutions recognize particular identities shapes the identities in the group context. And I mean that, like in Canada, the obvious example is, and it's not really about multiculturalism, is the way that indigeneity is recognized by the state shapes the dynamics of identity and discussions of identity within the groups. And that can sometimes cause problems that privilege specific kinds of dialogue between the group or specific members of the group and the majority population. That will maybe sort of, so again, maybe it comes back to a kind of question of what is a successful dialogue? Because if we have a dialogue between members of the group who kind of conform to the versions of identity that exist and are recognized and affirmed by the state, then we might not in fact actually get a sort of, there will be people in that identity group whose positions are maybe marginalized and left out. And I think you kind of touched on this a little bit at the end of your talk, but I'd be interested to hear more about that.
You said there were 4 questions. Should we take 2 and 2?
Sure. Well, we've got 2 more. Do you want those?
Oh, I thought you said with you included them.
I have a comment that you can.
Yeah, well,
it's not.
if you said that we're getting towards the time point, I was following your very first suggestion about grouping questions.
Yeah, okay. So we'll get another question from Mark.
I've already asked a question, although my question may even not be unrelated to Katie's question. So, it struck, so I thought, so this is in some way a friendly question, although it has it might have a bite in the tail. And this is that it looks like indigenous people, so you began by saying, look, this is multiculturalism without liberalism. And this is, and indigenous people in this country don't think of themselves in multicultural terms because they don't think of themselves as just one culture. But they certainly don't want a liberal foundation to it because that's not part of their tradition. And everything that you say, like in terms of the contextual way, the way in which you're thinking about we-based identity and dialogue, which I think actually builds on what Kingston, everything that you say looks like indigenous people could fit. So although you frame it in terms of, post-ethnic migration-induced plural cultures, indigenous people look like they'll fit, except that they would deny the term you're accepting, which is the term multiculturalism. You follow me? So I think your dialogue works in many ways for some of the kinds of dialogue that we need, that the Canadian state and people need to have with indigenous people, and we're trying to have over a long period, not getting very far. And also racism matters there too. But yet, so anyway, I just thought that you maybe framed it, I think the theory works for this group, might be extended to have insights in this, for this group, but I just thought it was interesting that they would deny your term. So maybe that's a comment or a question.
Okay, so if I take 2 and then leave 2.
Well, there's just the one more.
Oh, there's just the one more, sorry. I thought you said you had something, Steve. Okay, well, yeah, let's take Bruce. Should we take Neil?
I just have a comment to add to this. As a Yank in the room, this is so different from American experience and understanding. When I moved here in the early 1970s, I heard all of this stuff about mosaic, and I thought, what? I grew up in a melting pot. The American conception of this is wholly different, and the experience was different. And I can give you 2 experiences of my growing up as a kid in New York as to what the dimensions of this become. Grade 4, public school 174, Queens, New York, 4th grade. Teacher, Mrs. Parsons, a very nice, authoritative Protestant lady, over a class of immigrant kids, parents, grandparents, almost all of us born abroad. And she's explaining to us about America and the American Constitution and the flag and the Great Seal and its Latin motto, E pluribus unum, from many one. Well, what that meant was the 13 original colonies, but that's not what she explained to us. She went around the room and she asked each kid, where did your parents or grandparents come from? So, Italy, Poland, Russia, Sicily, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, what? And goes all around the room, and she says, yes, from many, one. And we understood that immediately. Every kid in that classroom had a father, an uncle, an older brother, even a grandfather, some mothers and grandmothers who worked in the Brooklyn Navy Yard through World War II. One little girl lost her father. We understood that message implicitly. Go forward 8 years or so, I was a senior in high school taking advanced American history in a private school, so we didn't have to teach the public school curriculum. Sitting in the class, the teacher was an Irish Catholic. He was teaching us about Jim Crow and the Ku Klux Klan, which at that point had been guilty of some of the goriest lynchings of the 1950s. We were acutely conscious of this. We were getting mobilized in the early stages of the civil rights movement. And I remember he says to us, do you know what the KK Klanners say that the KKK really stands for? Well, he said, kikes, coons, and Catholics, everything they hate. And we were absolutely stunned. We don't remember how up until the 1960s, the hostility against Catholics was very, very strong in the United States. I remember John Kennedy's election was a single striking incident of that issue. We sat there in stunned silence, a class of 20 New York kids, only 3 of whom were white Protestants. The rest of us were Jewish, Italian, Irish, black. And one of the black kids very ostentatiously looks around the classroom and he says, well, I guess that includes almost all of us. And never forgot that lesson through what came after. And you have the 2 dimensions of the American melting pot experience. In the 50s, even in the 60s, they still used to talk in the majoritarian presence about hyphenated Americans. You don't hear that anymore. And it has a very different dimension. To give you the sense of it, it's the...
We're running out of time.
Yeah, sorry, but I'm just making a point about identity and inclusion in this culture. I'll give you a South African example to get the point. Before the end of apartheid, they used to talk about South African blacks. After the end of apartheid, the noun and adjective changed. They now talk about black South Africans. And you find something similar in the United States taking place where they talk about Italian Americans or Jewish Americans. It is a very important shift of consciousness on this. And it's a very different orientation toward what culture and inclusion mean. Excuse me.
Okay, thank you, Bruce. Well, yeah, let's go with the order the questions came. So, you know, I kind of like to embrace and make space for identities. That's pretty important for multiculturalism. But I suppose there can be pretty awful identities. I mean, there can be KKK identities. So as I understand your question, that multiculturalism perhaps needs to have some critical space to think about where are these identities coming from, or shaping these identities, because the identities can be shaped under conditions of domination. So I place in my work generally, but I think perhaps also a little bit, it may have come out in that talk, an importance on minority political assertiveness. Minorities allowed to say who they are. And actually, that's how I got into these issues in the very first place. Otherwise, I used to work on some totally different area of political theory. And cut a very long story short, in the 1980s, I got involved in some kind of policy work and racial equality activism and so on. And like, the consensus was that all of us who are not white are black. And I said, well, I'm not. And they kind of thought, well, that was a terrible thing to say, because they said, but this is divisive. I said, well, surely I should decide what my identity is, not you. And at that point, it was actually a very difficult thing to say. It required a little bit of courage, even if I say so myself. Now it's not controversial at all, except the new anti-color racism following Black Lives Matter has, to some extent, perhaps not as much as in the United States, revived a certain kind of racial dualism, a black-white perspective. But it's doing so on very infertile soil, because if we look at ethnic minorities in Britain, black people are actually a very small proportion. So they're going to run out of rhetoric. I mean, the rhetoric's going to run out of mileage. But I take your point that one can't just celebrate any identity, and I don't think anything I've said goes in that direction. So I emphasize the importance of minority participation, and even more so, you know, I mean, the Titanic Versus was not a garden party. There was a lot of very aggressive identity manifestation. So I don't like the aggression, but I like minorities asserting their own identity. Because Muslims up to that point in Britain weren't thought of as Muslims. They were thought of as Asians, which in Britain is short for South Asians, not East Asians. And a lot of Muslims got up and said, look, I'm not Asian, I'm not black, I'm not even Pakistani, meaning that's where my parents may be from, but what's it got to do with me? But I am a Muslim, and I will not tolerate insults to Muslims. And if we're to live together, let's talk about what we're going to do when such aggression takes place. So I don't have a comprehensive theory about what you might call benign identities and malign identities. I mean, this is beginning to look a bit like my answer to Margaret, but not having a comprehensive theory about dialogue. But I don't think I'm in the position of I'm putting up with anything. It's more like what has already emerged, that I don't know what perhaps the limits are on what I'm putting up with, or willing to put up with. So that would be the kind of answer I'd offer you. And then tying indigenous people in, well, of course, if you say, oh, my theory can go elsewhere, beyond where I'm even claiming, who am I to disagree? But I would have thought there was a pretty fundamental difference between issues to do with indigenous people and post-immigration group formations. Land and conquest is pretty big. So yes, the need for dialogue, and even if you like, you know, given that I was talking about an imperial legacy, even in Britain, there has to be a addressing of the past in a spirit of, if you like, truth and reconciliation. But I think the issues of indigenous people, whether here or in other countries, and, you know, I know a little bit about, not much, about Australian multiculturalism, how that too Aboriginal peoples in Australia to push that away and say, well, that's for migrants, but now talk to us about all the treaties you've broken. Yeah, so insofar as dialogue captures something, and certainly not wanting to build everything on a foundational liberalism, captures the kind of politics that indigenous people find most intuitively plausible and promising. Yeah, that may be true, but I just thought there were some other bigger, larger issues. So America. I mean, what's really interesting about the United States is, I mean, where does it really stand in the kinds of debates we're having in this class, in this room, about multiculturalism? Because as a civil society, multiculturalism is quite strong in the United States. In terms of state policies, certainly federal state policies, it's not in the way, of course, it is in Canada or even the United Kingdom, or the way it addresses those issues aren't even how European states are addressing them. That is to say, it's not addressing them as federal state issues. So I think the United States is an interesting case of a dynamic multiculturalism, and your example had elements of dynamism in, change about how people belong to the United States. A dynamic multicultural society in which both identity assertion and wanting to be American and wanting to be part of the melting pot go hand in hand is a very interesting case, which seems to sit side by side with the kind of state laissez-faire about multiculturalism. I don't see many people writing about this, but Bruce, if you think there's some interesting writing, I'd like to know about that. One person who I do find interesting on this is Alexander. I can't think of his first name just for a moment. He's a sociologist. He's written about civil society. And he's got a very interesting book where he devotes 3 or 4 parts of the book to different groups, how they have created a civil society activism and a public voice as a way of becoming part of the American mainstream, as a way of making American mainstream their own. So he's got a part on African Americans, one part on Jews, and I'm not sure about what else is in the book. Jeffrey Alexander, that's what I'm thinking. So have a look at that book. I think it's really interesting, and we don't have a comparable book like that in Britain or in Europe.
Where you see the real synthesis of a multiracial, multi-ethnic melting pot society is in popular culture.
Yeah, that's what he wants to.
That's where it does. Where to be an American means you know all about Asian food and Hispanic food and humor.
So he wants to emphasize high culture, if you like, more Saul Bellow and less lasagna.
Well, the writers for various communities all play a very important role in this, but the other part of it is the popular culture, and in particular humor.
Yes, he emphasizes humor. Woody Allen and so on. Yeah.
All right, well, thank you very much.